If you have any questions for our author, please type those in the chat. And as you're going through the event, just any time is fine. Rachel and I will take turns posing them when we get to the Q&A.
So yes, as we go, just if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll save them up for the end and ask them for you then. And then one friendly reminder, these are tough times for independent businesses, not just bookstores, but all sorts of small local businesses all over the country. You can really help a lot by remembering to shop local this holiday season, whatever local businesses you love, not just us. Please support them if you want to keep them. Also, you can really help by shopping early this holiday season. We've been hearing in the book world about a lot of anticipated supply chain issues. I think that could be true in other businesses as well. And certainly we're wanting to avoid crowding in the holidays. So shopping early, November is the new December. Weekdays are fantastic. That really helps us. So that is the boring part. This evening, I get to be the lucky one who introduces our guest authors. Thomas Frank is an author whose work I have admired very greatly for a really long time. His books include Listen Liberal, Kitty the Billionaire, The Wrecking Crew, and What's the Matter with Kansas. A former columnist for the Wall Street Journal and Harper's, he's the founding editor of The Baffler and writes regularly for The Guardian. He's with us tonight to celebrate his latest book, The People Know. He's going to be interviewed this evening for us by Eric Morser, a professor in the history department at Skidmore College. He's the author of Hinterland Dreams, The Political Economy of a Midwestern City, which was nominated for the Kenneth Jackson Award for Best Book in North American Urban History, and the Book Award of Merit from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and The Fires of New England, which explores radical political protest in rural New Hampshire after the American Revolution. He's also a longtime and great friend of the Northshire bookstore, and I'm thrilled to have both Eric Morser and Thomas Frank with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming them, and Eric, why don't you take it away?
Great, Rachel. Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. I can't say enough about Northshire. It's a great place, one of my favorite places in town. And Thomas, I want to thank you for writing this book, too. I found it really engaging. It's provocative in a constructive way. It was fun for me as a former graduate student in history to see the names Lawrence Goodwin show up, Richard Hofstadter show up. So it was fun for me in that sense. And to get everything rolling, I was just curious, one of the questions I like to ask my students when we're reading authors in class is to consider how it is that a moment in time or a place shapes the kind of books and the stories that we read about. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about what it was that motivated you to write this book, to focus on this topic at this moment in time.
Oh, that's a great question. But I want to ask you a question first. What was your book about? What city in the Midwest was it?
It was a city called La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry, I don't know where that is.
Mississippi City, Mississippi River City.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I'm from Kansas City originally. And the genesis of this book, I mean, it's actually pretty simple. So I went to history graduate school back in the 80s and the 90s, and I studied this thing called populism, which was, as I've discovered since my new book came out, that a lot of people do not know what that was. It was the last sort of big third-party movement in American history. It was in the 1890s, and it was the last time a third party met with any kind of success. They elected governors and senators and representatives and mayors and all that sort of thing. In basically mainly on the Great Plains and in the South, but also in the West. The only part of the country where they didn't do very well is, well, where you guys are right now in the Northeast, in New England. But it's a particular, the populist movement is a particular point of pride for people from Kansas, because Kansas was their big state. This was kind of the center of populism. Kansas in the 1890s was kind of a radical place, sort of the opposite of what it is now. You know, today it's this very, deeply Republican state. But in the 1890s, it still had a lot of its kind of abolitionist heritage was still intact, and so populism took root there and did really well. And when you study populism, you figure out right away that what it was a left-wing farmer labor movement. And this is, the way the word is used today is completely the opposite of that. And this is sort of the reason I wrote the book. I've been out of graduate school for a long time, haven't thought about populism for a long time. But when you open up, I just opened up the Washington Post the other day, and there was an op-ed. I mean, you can't stop these guys from using this word. They use the word populism to mean racist demagogue. You guys everybody has seen the word used this way. And this, at first, this just made me angry. And because that's not what populism was, and how dare they use the name of this movement that people in my part of America really are fond of. How dare they take its name in vain and use it to mean exactly the opposite of what populism really was. But then it occurred to me, as I dug into this question, that there was more going on here than just some people getting, twisting the definition of a word. That there's a very interesting history to how populism is defined and to how the word got flipped. And what I finally wound up writing about, I think probably for more than half of the book, is what I call anti-populism. People who hate farmer labor movements, people who think that movements of ordinary working class people are dangerous. And no matter what they say, they can say that they're really wonderful and everything, but we know secretly that they're always going to wind up being racist movements of racist demagoguery. And that's how the word is used today. And once I started researching anti-populism, all sorts of things fell into place for me. So the original anti-populists in the 1890s, and by the way, I'll shut up in a second. I have a problem if I talk too much, Eric. I just go and go and go. And but populism was met with this sort of incredible hostility from the elites of the 1890s, from the sort of, big city newspaper publishers and railroad barons and tycoons and academics of that period. And their objections to populism, the stereotype that they built up of populism, is the same stereotype that we have today, and that you see in newspapers today, and it's very widely. It's the way the word is used all over the world today, and that is a really fascinating story. How this came about. I was on a different Zoom call about an hour ago, and this is too inside DC, but I said that the way the word populism is used, that it's like the Pizzagate of the intellectuals. It's this kind of crazy conspiracy theory that it took me a really long time to understand how this happened, and how the word got flipped. Anyhow, that's the story of the book. And then along the way, there are a whole bunch of fascinating local stories and historical stories about populist movements. The original one in the 1890s, the sort of the story of the 1930s and of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, which is a kind of high watermark of populism in America, and the civil rights movement. And lots of really fun anecdotes from then. And then also, this is my first book that has color illustrations in it. This is a new thing for me. So all of these wonderful sort of political cartoons from the 1890s and the 1930s that I was able to look up to show the kind of continuity of anti-populism over time. People who hate, mass movements of the lower orders. And have denounced them from that day to this with remarkably similar terminology. Anyhow, that's what the book's about.
Well, that sounds great. And one thing that I really like that you do in this is try and reclaim the meaning of the word. And because the word has been so kind of distorted, and I have to say, I hate to say this, by historians who have put forth a vision of it that doesn't really fit what you lay out. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, if somebody's reading this, what do you want them to know about what populism really is?
Okay, but historians are some historians were to blame, I think, back in the 1950s, but by and large, historians today know what the populist movement was in the 1890s. They generally, this is a group of scholars who generally get it right. The ones who get it wrong are, it's generally, I mean, this is easy, it's political scientists who use the word however they want. And there's actually a pedagogy now. I was astonished to learn this. There's a whole pedagogy called global populism studies that is entirely based on misunderstanding this movement from the 1890s. And these are people that are not interested in history. I mean, in the least, they know what they know and they don't want to be told otherwise, you know. But I'm sorry, Eric, what was the other part of your question? You
just if you wanted somebody to take something essential away about what populism is from this book, what would you tell them that they need to know about it?
So my definition of the word, for starters, and this is important to remember when you're talking about the way the word gets twisted over the decades. Populism is an American word. It was we know when the word was made up, and we know why. We even know the names of the people who made it up. It was a bunch of Kansas state politicians riding on a train between Kansas City and Topeka in 1891, and so the Populist Party had just had its first big success. They had swept the Kansas legislative elections in November of 1890, and here they are about 6 months later, and they realized that the formal name of the Populist Party, it was actually called the People's Party, and they realized that was kind of a clunker. That wasn't a very good phrase, and so they said, we got to come up with a better name, a nickname for the people who support our movement. And they sat around and brainstormed, and they came up with the word populist. And they had it in newspapers within a few days. And I was able to find, doing my research, I was able to find what I believe is the very first appearance of the word in print anywhere in the world. And for decades, that was the only definition of populism, was this movement, this American farmer labor movement in the 1890s. But if you take that movement seriously and extrapolate from that movement, you can see pretty easily that there is a populist tradition in American life, in American history. And the way I define that tradition is it's a transracial movement of working class people who come together for economic democracy. And all the elements of that definition are important. So it's a movement, it's a mass movement. The populist movement organized millions and millions and millions of farmers. It was a huge movement of ordinary people, of working class people. They made at first anyways, they made a very, they made a really shocking at the time effort to include Black people in this mainly white movement. And this was shocking because there was very little transracial solidarity in those days. This was a really bad era for race relations in the South, but the populists tried very briefly to overcome that. And then economic democracy. So what populism was about, what their issues were, where they wanted a program for farmers, government programs for farmers. Farmers were in deep trouble in those days. They wanted to get the U.S. off the gold standard, which is a confusing issue for a lot of modern day people, but I can explain it if you want to know, but they were right about this. The gold standard was a terrible monetary system, and they wanted to rein in railroad monopolies, which farmers, and this, by the way, this is still true, farmers confront these monopolies in their small towns all over America. And back then, these monopolies were mainly in the person of railroads. Railroads are natural monopolies. If you live near a railroad, you've only got one choice, which railroad you're going to deal with. And the railroad, of course, knows that. And so the populists demanded that the railroads be nationalized. And they also, along the way, they realized that the world they were living in the 1890s was a time of incredible concentration of wealth, concentration of income, monopoly power, and political corruption. And the populists figured, and a lot like today, and the populists figured out that these things all went hand in hand, that the Vanderbilt family being millionaires went hand in hand with the Vanderbilt family being able to say, bribe the entire state legislature of New York State, and stuff. And this kind of thing happened all the time in those days. So they came up with a whole bunch of things. They wanted to sort of declare war on lobbying. They wanted votes for women, which they were the first political party, big political party, to demand votes for women. They wanted the secret ballot. They wanted to. At the time, U.S. senators were chosen by state legislatures. They wanted to change that to the system we have today. And here's the funny thing. Although the Populist Party didn't live very long, about 7 or 8 years, all of these things happened. All of the things that I described, all of their demands eventually came true. So these things turned out to all be pretty good ideas. But if you take my definition that I gave you a minute ago, what populism really is and what the populist tradition is, you also see that this is in the 1930s. You again have these mass movements of working people that are explicitly anti-racist. This is the labor movement in the 1930s. And you have economic democracy in the person of Franklin Roosevelt, bringing the New Deal, doing all these wonderful things. And you also have a kind of cultural populism then that's very memorable. The Frank Capra movies, the WPA art, the celebration of ordinary Americans, and even of sharecroppers, that kind of thing. And you also see a big hint of populism in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Martin Luther King at one point explicitly gives a shout out to the populist movement of the 1890s. And he was, when he was murdered, he was trying to lead that movement towards into becoming a movement for economic democracy. They called it the freedom budget, was his great idea, a sort of gigantic New Deal, a New Deal or a great society on a gigantic scale. And unfortunately, that was never realized. But that's the populist tradition. And you notice I have left out the name Donald Trump because he's not part of it. He talks in a kind of a gruff way, and he talks like and he reaches out to, and he's been fairly successful reaching out to a certain part of the working class electorate. But he's not, but he's not really a populist, because what he wants to do has nothing to do with economic democracy. It's all about getting tax cuts and deregulating polluters and, this kind of thing. So he doesn't make the cut for me. But Bernie Sanders actually sort of does, and I think Sanders is he here in the audience? By the way, you're in his neighborhood, aren't you?
Close.
But if he was here, he would understand what I'm talking about. He understands the importance of social movements of ordinary people and of social movements for economic democracy. So he very much fits into the definition.
I'm really happy you brought up Martin Luther King, because I love what you do with him in this book, because I think we have kind of a sanitized vision of Martin Luther King as the champion of integration. And left out of that is Martin Luther King organizing with striking workers. And I'm curious why that is the case. Why don't we think of King as a champion of working people?
Well, because King is of course, is a hero, and his eloquence and his leadership, and we all want to identify with him. And frankly, the economic democracy part of the formula, which is, if you actually read King's speeches and read the biographies of him, was a really important part of who he was. This is stuff he really believed in, and he spoke to union meetings all the time. And in fact, when he died, when he was assassinated, he was helping out at a strike in Memphis. And he talked about this stuff all the time. Frankly, that is we airbrush that out because that stuff is still pretty controversial to us. We being against racism, being against George Wallace and his thugs in Alabama, and being for school integration and stuff. That's pretty much that's very widely accepted today. But the labor stuff, the economic stuff, that's much more difficult. Can I give you another example of that? So Eric, I'm here in Bethesda, Maryland, and one of the things that I noticed when I was writing this book is I wrote this book while during the Trump administration, which is thankfully, hopefully, coming to an end now. It's now its ending date. We know what it's going to be. We know the day he's going to pack his bags and go to Mar-a-Lago. But I wrote this book while he was in the White House, and I live in a pretty affluent suburb of Washington, D.C. And I was, it was very interesting to me to watch my neighbors sort of be radicalized during the Trump years, and to come around to supporting all of these liberal causes. And, I'm very liberal, and so I'm all in favor of that. But what always intrigued me about this is that there's one liberal cause always left out when these people go to list all the things that they believe in, or when they have roundtable discussions, or when they have, and I give a bunch of examples in the book, and that is labor. They never want to talk about the travails of the working class. They never want to talk about those the issues of the workplace, forming unions, that kind of thing. That is still highly controversial to a lot of to a lot of people. Then there's, I should stop there before I get myself in trouble.
Well, I'm sure I'll figure out some way to get you in trouble by asking. No, that's great. And I'm curious about what the heck happened in the 1970s, because part of what you talk about is how the 70s is a really important turning point, where the case that you make in the book is that Democrats increasingly turn away, or liberals turn away from this base and this kind of labor vision, and Republicans become better at talking to this audience. And why is that the case? Do you have a sense of why that happened?
Wow. And, but that's, that is the subject that just fascinates everyone these days. I mean, I was meeting with a Japanese friend of mine yesterday, and he comes to America every couple of years. He's fascinated by our politics. And he always asks me the same question. He says, in Japan, working class people identify with the more left of the parties. And it's like, yeah, they do that all over the world, but America is different. This is part of American exceptionalism. It's so weird. And that whole flip, that whole shift has been, I've now written, going back to What's the Matter with Kansas, I've written about this again and again and again. And it is absolutely fascinating to me. And I think fascinating to a lot of people because it's so counterintuitive. And it's so strange. And it's also, if you're as old as I am, I'm 55, and I remember the 1970s when the Democratic Party was so closely identified with organized labor. I mean, the idea that the two would ever come apart, that would have been crazy, but it happened. And it happened, as you said, in the 1970s. It happened slowly. And then it happened much faster. What's the Hemingway quote? It's like it happened for a little bit, and then it happened all of a sudden, all at once, till by the time you have, you get to the Bill Clinton administration. Bill Clinton is openly identifying with Wall Street, that was formerly, the arch enemy of the Democratic Party. I mean, it's a huge transition, and this is. It is absolutely fascinating to me. But basically, to make a long story short, the Democratic Party decided after the end of the turmoil of the 1960s, they decided that, a lot of the leaders of the big unions in America had supported the Vietnam War. Now, not all the rank and file, not all the members of the unions had supported the Vietnam War, but a lot of the leadership had. And in their defense, they did it because they thought they were supporting a man who had been really great for them, which is Lyndon Johnson. They thought they were being loyal to a president who had been a great friend. And but that wasn't good enough. And the Democratic Party really turned against them once after Hubert Humphrey lost in 1968, and after the liberal world seemed to be crumbling. And the Democrats openly, by the way, nothing that I'm saying here is secret. They wrote about this openly. The newspaper columnists, Democratic Party leaders, all, big thinkers, all of these people said, we need a new constituency. We need to identify ourselves with a different group. And the group that they chose at first was, the young kids coming off the college campuses who had protested against the Vietnam War. And that sort of morphed over the years into basically the white collar, affluent professional class. That's who those kids became, and that's who the Democrats started identifying with. And they're open about this. They talked about it. They wrote about it. There's doesn't require any conspiracy theories or reading between the lines or anything like that. They've always been very open about this. And that's where we are today. The Democratic Party in this last election last week had great success in these affluent parts of America where I'll give you the perfect example. I grew up in a suburb of Kansas City. It's in Johnson County, Kansas. It was, when I was a kid, was one of the most affluent places in America, and was also one of the most Republican places in America. I mean, we went for Goldwater. You know, it was like that. Nobody went for Goldwater, but Johnson County, Kansas did. And they have not gone for a Democrat since Woodrow Wilson in 1916. And that's, back then it was a rural county. Today it's a bustling suburb with hundreds of thousands of people in it. Well, they just went for Joe Biden. First Democrat they voted for since 1916. This is incredible. This is the world that I grew up in, turned on its head. Orange County, California went for Hillary Clinton. I don't know what they did in this election, but they went for Hillary Clinton in 2016. This is happening all over America. And for a certain kind of Democrat, this is a great victory. This is what they've dreamed of for decades, and they've finally achieved it. But I'm here to tell you, I think this is very dangerous to have a left party. We have a two-party system in America. It's enshrined in law. You can't get out of it. You can't have a populist party anymore. And because in this two-party system, to have the more left of the two parties decide that it wants to be a party of wealthy people that's a really strange and I think dangerous thing. And the reason I say dangerous is because it opens the door to this very scary working class appeal that Donald Trump sort of personified, and before him that Pat Buchanan personified, or Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan. But you see that progression: Nixon, Reagan, Buchanan, Trump. It gets worse and worse and worse all the time, as we go along. Anyhow, that's where we are. Like I said, Eric, I talk way too much. I am so sorry.
No. This is great to hear. It's great to hear your insights on this. And I mean, as you're saying that, I'm kind of taken back to the pre-Civil War era, not to get too history minded here. But I mean, one thing that historians have illustrated to us is that if people don't feel like they have a choice politically, then they'll embrace violence. They'll follow whoever who speaks to them, to their concerns. And part of what your book raises is whether or not certain people, working class people, have a place to go.
Exactly. And that's I mean, this is all very depressing, but one of the things that I noticed in the Trump years, and I should say that I should remind you, the book is a history of this populist tradition in America. It's this very optimistic story. It's this wonderful story, but it's also a story of something really dark, of anti-populism, of people who despise mass movements of working class people since the 1890s. And who say, I mean, this is what they said, that the populists were, they were paranoid, they were mentally ill, they were, let's go down the list here. They didn't know what they were doing. They were anti-intellectual. They were, how dare they attack the gold standard? Every economist in the world knows that's the way to run an economy. But most importantly, they would say that the populists represented the danger of democracy, when the lower orders think that they can rise up and take over the economy and the government from the people who should naturally be running the economy and the government, that they can invert the hierarchy. And the ruling elite of the 1890s said this with this incredible tones of contempt for populism. And you can trace this history, this aristocratic idea in American politics through the 1930s, when it was resoundingly defeated. Roosevelt just beat these guys all hollow, but they used the same arguments against him and against organized labor. It's like, how dare they try to, the lower orders, the unfit, the people that social Darwinism has chosen to be workers. How dare they try to take over, control of the economy by using, democracy? But you can trace that to our own time. And there is a strong anti-populist sort of strain in liberalism nowadays. The earlier anti-populism that I talk about, this is very right-wing stuff. This is the owners of society. These are, what we would today say very right-wing. They didn't use that term in the 1890s, but ultra-conservative people. But there's a lot of liberals now who say the same thing, that the problem in our country is the people. It's not that that our politicians are wrong or that we have the wrong message. The problem is the voters. And they express this contempt for ordinary people. Well, I'm very sorry to say the perfect example of this was Hillary Clinton's remark when she called Trump supporters deplorables. And she knew she had made a terrible mistake. I mean, Hillary Clinton is a working politician and knew that was a terrible blunder and tried to get out of it, right away. But what was interesting about that moment was how many liberal commentators said, no, she's right about that. They are deplorables. These are the lowest orders of society. These are the most unfit. These are the worst members of the community trying to tell the best what to do. The best always being they themselves. The people who went to fancy colleges and work in, Silicon Valley or whatever the hell it is, journalism, And that's very disturbing to me. And that's not a good path forward. And that sort of, I think of that as being a very dangerous tendency. Dangerous, again, because it invites this kind of fake right-wing, this kind of fake workerist movement that you see Donald Trump building right now.
I am wondering if we're at a moment with liberalism now. And I know you offer some really insightful criticisms about how in the 1970s and the 80s, liberals turned away from working class people. But, I look now and I hear Bernie Sanders and I hear AOC. And I wonder if perhaps the Democratic Party is at a moment where you're going to see a re-embrace of this kind of language.
Wouldn't that be great? I wrote a story about that in The Guardian the other day, so basically saying that's what they have to do. So President Biden, I just said it. President Biden, how about that? President Biden, his first priority has to be dealing with COVID. And by the way, when he does that, I'm going to come to your bookstore on the paperback tour and see everybody in person. We're going to have a good old time and we're going to drink beer and we're going to sign books and we're going to do all the things we used to do. But okay, he's got to get COVID under control. And then the second thing, the second priority has to be figuring out what to do about Trumpism. This is not going anywhere. Trump himself is going to run again in 4 years, or somebody else is going to, using the same themes, but doing a better job with it. Somebody just said Marco Rubio. Yeah, I think the next Trump is going to be a much better politician. Trump was a terrible, just speaking in practical Washington, D.C. terms, this guy was a dreadful retail politician. And it's amazing that he got anywhere. And he was incompetent as a president. But the next Trump won't be. And that's the thing. And so Biden has to be thinking about how to nip this thing in the bud. And you're right. There's all kinds of voices now in the Democratic Party saying we need to reconsider what we've been doing. And I don't want to get too optimistic here because that's not my nature. But Biden himself has always had a kind of a blue collar streak to him. And he's comfortable speaking in union halls. He likes to refer to himself as middle-class Joe from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And I like that side of Joe Biden. Now, his record doesn't, doesn't match up. He doesn't have a lot to, he can't really back that up in any way. But he does understand those issues, or he can be made to understand them. So let's be a little bit hopeful about Joe Biden before I go completely cynical on him, which is always my want.
Well, you end the book with a really pretty inspirational message about how it is that if working people can build a mass movement again, that integrates people of different ethnicities and races, then they can change the world. And I'm curious how that would happen. How practically, how would that come together?
Well, we look at the past models. That it has to be based on. My feeling is that it has to be based on some kind of shared economic experience. So you look at populism in the 1890s, and it came out of the last great third party movement. It came out of a group called the Farmers Alliance, which was an enormous millions and millions of members, one of the largest mass movements in American history. And it was, farmers were more than half of the population at the time, and they were a group that were on their way down economically speaking, and they came together to figure out what they could do about it, to try to understand their situation and read up on the economics and the politics of it and try to figure it out. And eventually they went into politics and formed this movement, and they didn't have immediate success, but within 30 or 40 years, everything they wanted had been achieved, including votes for women. And by the way, that's one of the parts of the story that is not well known. They actually got votes for women in Colorado and Idaho, where the populist party was able to do that in those states in the 1890s. But you look at the 1930s, and again, this shared economic situation, the Depression, and the unions were organizing by enormous numbers. They grew by a factor of 3 in the course of the 1930s. And then World War II encouraged this sense of solidarity. We were all in this together. We were all Americans. And I like to think that experience of the 30s and the 40s made possible the kind of middle-class society that I was born into. But that sense of solidarity has completely evaporated these days. And I mean, like doing things like Zoom calls, and social media, it's no replacement for, I think social media actually divides us more than it brings us together. It makes people hate each other. And I don't know how we're going to get solidarity back, but we have to do it somehow. And I have friends out there who propose all sorts of different ways to build a movement, building it around student debt, for example. But I don't think that would be broad-based enough. But I think you're going to see some kind of revitalization of union organizing. We have to see that has to happen, or else we're just going to continue going downhill in this country. And, I think Bernie Sanders definitely understood that you had to build a mass movement. Now, it's difficult to do it around a politician. I don't think that's a particularly hopeful way to go about it, but he understands the need for it. So I am hopeful that something will emerge. It's got to, right? This can't go on. It just can't go on. To see a great middle-class nation like ours come apart in the way that it has been, it's the story of my life, and it's a very depressing story. But yes, I am ultimately hopeful about it. Yes, because look, and again, I talk too much, I know, and I'm sorry. We are the most democratic people on the planet. Not in terms of our formal democratic institutions. We have the Electoral College and things like that, the Supreme Court, but our sensibility. We are the most anti-elitist people, the most anti-hierarchical people anywhere. It's in our DNA as a nation. And it just seems natural to me that has to come back to the populist tradition sooner or later. It has to.
What role do intellectuals have to, dare I say, what role do history professors have to play in this?
So that's a really good question. So, I actually think this is the most interesting part of the book, what I'm about to relate. Others might disagree, but I think this part of it is absolutely fascinating. And this is the story of how the word got flipped, of how the meaning of the word went from being a positive thing to a negative thing. And in fact, to being completely the opposite of what it originally was. And the story goes like this. So populism, it rose and it fell from the years 1890 to about 1897. And then it was gone. And then historians got a hold of it. And by and large, historians in the 1920s and 30s and 40s were very fond of populism. They thought it was a heroic movement. It introduced all of these important issues. It was the moment when you had a real left party in America, and it introduced all the sort, like the Labor Party in England or something like that. And it introduced all of these important concerns into our politics, and they were heroes. Then in the 1950s happens, and a new generation of intellectuals come up. They are called the consensus scholars. And their sort of guiding idea is that dissent is something alien to the American tradition, that we've always agreed on pretty much everything. You know, it doesn't matter what party you're in, doesn't matter what faction you're with. All our leaders have always agreed on everything. And the people who don't agree, there's something wrong with them. And in 1955, the sort of great leader of the consensus intellectuals was a historian named Richard Hofstadter, the great historian of that era. He wrote a book about reconsidering the American progressive tradition, the American radical tradition. It was called The Age of Reform. And so he took this subject that had been this favorite subject of American historians, the subject of populism and progressivism and Roosevelt and all that. And he reimagined it using the sort of tools of psychology, which were new in the 1950s, very advanced sort of method for a historian at that time. And he said, populism was not heroic. Populism is not what you think it is. Populism is a movement of backward-looking people who are anti-intellectual, who don't understand globalization, who don't understand, and we know they're anti-intellectual because they don't live in big cities. You can only be an intellectual if you live in a city. We know that they are backward because they're on their way down, and people who are on their way down are dangerous. They're given to authoritarianism. They're given to anti-Semitism, xenophobia. You go right down the list. Racism, paranoia, all of these things. And this book was enormously influential. He won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a bestseller. I think it was a Book of the Month Club. I think my copy of it is a Book of the Month Club edition. And it was massively influential. It's been described as the most influential work of American history ever written. And then two things are really interesting about this. So Hofstadter says the word populism is, from here on, the word populism is going to refer to any movement of working class people who are deluded and authoritarian and racist and backwards. And so he starts using the word in the way we use it today. And it's immediately picked up by all the other consensus intellectuals. So Daniel Bell starts using it this way. Edward Shills, famous sociologist, starts using it this way. Seymour Lipset, all of these guys are sociologists. They all start using it this way. Political science starts using the word populism to mean deluded movements of working class people. And the broader theme being that all movements of working class people are dangerous because they're authoritarian and racist. And so they're basically, you see what they're doing here. They're saying the working class movements are proto-fascist. They're looking at Nazi Germany and they're saying that was some kind of, that was well, here's the punchline. This is all wrong. Other historians took Hofstadter's work and they refuted it. They disproved it in this extraordinary way. And there's at least 100 books and articles refuting like single paragraphs of Hofstadter's. It's just like there has never been, well, there have been other historical interpretations that have been refuted, but this one was just like crushingly refuted. And it's just like no historian respects the Hofstadter thesis today. But here's the funny thing. It's still going. It doesn't matter that it was refuted. This is, like I said, this is the foundation of this whole pedagogy all over the world. Everybody uses Hofstadter's definition of populism today. This is how the word is used. And so I get to this point in the narrative and I'm like, wow, that is just the strangest damn thing. The guy is massively refuted, and yet everyone accepts his argument as being correct. Now, why is that? And the answer that I eventually came up with is because his answer is flattering to a certain group of people, very flattering. And this is when you read the sort of consensus, the great consensus works, you guys will know this one. Ooh, ouch. It's stuck in the bookshelf. The End of Ideology. I mean, there's lots of these, but all of these famous books from the 1950s, they were very concerned with the social position of the intellectual. It's all about this, this is the heyday of managerialism. So companies, for example, are no longer being run by, like the Trump family, people who own them, people who built them, or people who are heirs. They're being run by MBAs. They're being run by accountants. And the great departments in Washington are being run by people with advanced degrees. They're not being run by cronies of the president anymore. They're being run by professionals. And the Pentagon, classic example is the Pentagon, which is being run by Robert McNamara, the greatest managerial figure of that era. He'd been the CEO of Ford Motor. He had run the strategic bombings of Japan during World War II. This kind of thing. He was the great managerial figurehead. And so the consensus intellectuals said that is how you run government. That's how you get reform. Remember Hofstadter's title, The Age of Reform. So his argument is you don't get reform by building mass movements of working class people, mass movements of farmers, mass movements of workers. That doesn't do anything. That just leads to fascism. What you need are people like me and my friends and my highly educated, colleagues running everything. And we get together in Washington. You put us at the top of all these organizations, and we get together in Washington. We sit around the big mahogany table, and we come to a consensus with one another. And that's how you get reform. And that's how you manage an economy. And that's how you win the Cold War. And that's how you win the Vietnam War, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was the dream of the age. And so populism became the thing that they were displacing. So managerialism displaces populism. And to this day, there's, a huge number of academics and this is the Democratic Party now. That's what they believe in, is government by managers, these very rational people. You look at Barack Obama's cabinet, it's all of these guys with at the very top ranks of their professional achievement. Everybody has an advanced degree. He wasn't even the only Nobel laureate in his cabinet. There's more than one. Guys with genius grants, guys with Pulitzer prizes, and then should I let the other shoe drop?
Absolutely.
This always leads to failure. This is the track record of these people is just failure on failure. I mean, Robert McNamara in the Vietnam War is one of the greatest, most spectacular face plants in all of American history. It was run by the best and the brightest, and it was a disaster. Obama's genius cabinet and his genius people running the economy. He had the president of Harvard, Larry Summers. And they come in there and they bail out the banks. They keep the Bush bailouts going. They don't prosecute anybody. They just dust off the big banks and set them back up. And we don't get any of the reforms that are needed. And the sort of track record of this kind of managerial elitism is actually very, very poor. And in my opinion, the track record of populism is excellent. Populism actually brings real change. This managerialism is just, the elites doing favors for each other and, making sure they don't get prosecuted for their fraud, and making sure that the billionaires stay billionaires and the tax cuts stay intact and, that sort of thing. That's the grand theory of the book. I've given it away now, but I hope you go out and buy a copy because it's actually much more fun than I've just described it. It's actually kind of a hoot.
So we've got a ton of great audience questions. We're actually probably not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to jump in with one from Tara from a while back. She says, would you say that some of the movements that grew up around MLK, such as the Poor People's Campaign and the People's Budget, which is now being brought up in the New York State Legislature, are examples that are more recent of populism?
Absolutely. So I thought I mentioned that they called it it wasn't the People's Budget. They called it the Freedom Budget. And this is one of I come back to this a couple times in the book. I quote from it. And most definitely. So the Poor People's Campaign was his effort to transition the civil rights movement into a full-blown populist movement. And unfortunately, he died before it could bear fruit, and so it never came to. That story is very tragic and sad. It never came to pass. But one of the heroes of the book is Bayard Rustin, who was Martin Luther King's sort of right-hand man, strategist. This sort of very clever political thinker. on the left, of a kind that we never see in this country anymore. But that was his grand scheme, was to build a mass movement, transracial movement of working class people, and achieve economic democracy via this program they called the Freedom Budget. Now, I don't think Rustin would have referred to himself as a populist. This was the late 60s, and that word was not, in vogue at the time. But that's definitely what he was. He may not have known it, but that's what he was.
There's a great question here from Jeff Dexter. He says, do you think today's corporate centrist Democratic leaders are that way for ideological reasons, for re-electability reasons, or because they personally prefer slow, plodding change, or something else?
Oh, that's a good question. Why are they the way they are? I think it would be wrong to call it ideology. That would be glorifying it, I think, too much. But they did have a political theory behind all this back in the 80s and the 90s. I mean, they wrote about this all the time. And the theory was that basically they had to change because we were entering this information society. And which is true, that we are in a, the economy does change. The funny part of this is that they said we have to identify with the winners in the new order, rather than the Uber drivers out in California, they identify with the Silicon Valley people, and that has always struck me as incredibly cynical. And that's the sort of the terrible move that they made. One of the arguments that people often make, and I think is true to some degree, is that it is self-interested, because the Democrats that we're talking about, with a few exceptions, come from this social cohort. Their lives are defined by where they went to college and to graduate school. Both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama had these extraordinary, Ivy League careers, and Clinton was, a Rhodes Scholar and that sort of thing. And Hillary Clinton, the same thing. For them, their educational experience is absolutely, utterly what defined them. And they say this all the time, and they naturally propose education as a solution to everything because it was a solution for them. So they go to my people out in, Kansas and Missouri and say, your way of life is dying. What you need to do, Rahm Emanuel just said this the other day, what you need to do is go to a fancy college. What he specifically said is, he said, these jobs aren't coming back. You have to learn to code. This is what Rahm Emanuel said the other day. And it's like, it's politically such a stupid thing to say, because he just lost all those voters. To tell them that their way of life can never come back. That's a hell of a thing to say. And it's also wrong. There's all kinds of things that a powerful political party can do if it wants to, to bring back life, for economic life for 100 million of the citizens under its, who voted for it and who live under its umbrella. It's an incredible thing to say that to people. And it's an even more incredible thing to actually believe that your way of life can never come back. But there's another element here, which is that it's fun to be a party of rich people rather than a party of working people. It's much, look at, they retire. Bill Clinton's almost a billionaire now, this guy has so much money in his retirement. I look back at when Harry Truman retired. Harry Truman was the last president who didn't go to college. And when he retired, he didn't have any source of income. He wasn't a rich man. He went back to Kansas City. He's from Independence, Missouri, which is a suburb of Kansas City, and moved back into his mother-in-law's house. And the reporters followed him, and they said to him after he got into the house, they said, "What was the first thing you did when you got back, Mr. Truman?" And he said, "I carried the suitcases up to the attic." And a couple of years later, they had to he didn't have any source of income. They had to institute a pension for ex-presidents because Truman was so poor. And a couple of years later, he went to build the Truman Library. It was the first of the presidential libraries. And if you've ever been to Kansas City, it's fun to visit. It's one story. It's not a very imposing, it's a cool building, but it's not very imposing or anything like that. Truman managed to raise the money, but it cost about $1.5 million. and you look at what George W. Bush's library costs, or what Barack Obama's is scheduled to cost, or what Bill Clinton's cost. These are guys who are, they are out there raising hundreds of millions of dollars to build themselves these palaces, on into retirement. Look, it's fun to be a party of oil, or big oil, or of Silicon Valley, or Wall Street. It's not fun being the party of organized labor. I mean, it's righteous, but your presidential library, you don't have a lot to show for it,
So there's a wonderful question here from P. Prasad. They say, I'm very sympathetic to your argument about the hijacking of the term populism as something linked to racist and uneducated people. But I'm wondering how you see the very real and documented efforts of labor unions to systematically exclude people of different races. Think of the Chinese in California and Black people all over the country.
But we're talking about the past here, right? I mean, that's what I assume we're talking about. I mean, this was a problem. They have made, organized labor has made extraordinary strides along those lines. This is, I mean, yes, that was a huge problem in the past. But the part of the story that intrigues me is when labor turned against that. And this is part of the story of the 1930s. So one of the most populist groups in our history was called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And they were, unlike the AFL, so there were unions where this kind of attitude thrived, and those were generally the craft unions and the building trades and stuff like that. And they were in the AFL. The AFL refused to organize like auto workers or steel workers, unskilled workers in these these huge automobile plants, these huge steel mills, stuff like that. And the CIO said, well, we're going to go organize those people. And they were, you're talking about this incredible population, people from every imaginable background in these steel mills. And one thing you can't do if you're organizing people like that is be bigoted against one group of them or something like that, because then, the whole idea of a union is they're all in this together, solidarity. And so the CIO took on this very anti-racist attitude. And this is a story that I tell people, and a lot of people don't believe me, but it is true. I mean, you can read the history books yourself. This was the organized labor in the 1930s was one of the most anti-racist forces in society, outside of like the NAACP and or a few organizations like that. These guys were massively anti-racist by the standards of the day. And so it's a positive story. There are good stories out there. And I like to think that unions like that have overcome. I mean, that stuff comes up again every now and then, but they understand that is the road to destruction. To have an organization of working people that is racist is you're going to lose.
Thanks. I think we are just about out of time, but I'd like to try to splice two last questions together real quick. Ellen asks, but isn't there an overlap between old populism and the new type that we're seeing that has been redefined, Trump's type? Does it affect similar, does it attract similar members? And it's kind of...
does it attract the same elements of society? Yeah. So... the
same element, the same people. And Sydney says, would Trump's base not meet that original?
Okay, so Trump and Trump's base are two different things in my mind. Trump is not a populist because of what he's done. He promised some sort of populist sounding things, a few things here and there. Didn't he say he was going to get us like this great healthcare system? He was going to end the wars, all this crap. But what he did in power, of course, cut taxes, deregulated his friends so they could pollute. And here's my favorite anti-populist example. I mentioned earlier that populism was about taking America off the gold standard. This was a huge issue for them. And Trump just appointed a woman to the Federal Reserve Board who wants to put America back on the gold standard. It's just, you can't make this stuff up. But Trump's base, yes, these are people who are looking for, they are desperate. These are people who are looking for a way out. And Trump, sometimes what he promised sounded pretty good. Like he was going to reindustrialize, the sort of deindustrialized zone. I've been to a lot of those towns that have lost, their manufacturing, that have lost industry, that have lost their everything. And, you finally got a guy who's promising you the moon. He's looking at you and saying, I'm going to give you what you want, and I'm going to fix your problems. And by the way, I'm going to deal with the opioid epidemic also. Now, he didn't do any of it, but he did talk about it. And I think that is that there is, and this is, I've got myself in a lot of trouble with my liberal friends by saying this. I think that some people had very decent, let's put it this way, understandable reasons for voting for him. I think they were tricked. I think he is a demagogue. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. If you go back and look at his inaugural address, he talks about, I was there, I was in the audience, by the way. He talks about American carnage, and he describes empty mills. And I had just written a book called Listen Liberal, where I visited the town of Fall River, Massachusetts. It's not all that far from you. And you can see the empty mills there. They were built in the 19th century. They're very solid structures, so they haven't torn them down, and they're 6 or 7 stories high. And they do look like tombstones. And there's something intensely sad. And these people are, their lives have gone through the meat grinder just in the last 20 or 30 years. And Trump seemed to be speaking to them. Now, here in Washington, that speech was regarded as a terrible, how can you say something so negative and so bleak? I thought that was a good thing to be talking about. I wish Joe Biden would talk about that and how we're going to solve those people's problems. I would love to hear that. And I think when the Democrats do finally get their heads on straight and start talking about those people's lives again, you're going to see Trumpism. You're going to drain that swamp. We're going to drain the swamp of Trumpism. How's that for a mixed metaphor? I hope I've answered your question.
That's a great way to go out on, draining the swamp of Trumpism.
Of Trumpism, yes.
Thank you both so much. This has been a fantastic event. And really fun. Thank you.
Well, this has been a blast. And I wasn't kidding when I said, I can't wait for this epidemic to be over and the paperback is going to come out and I am going to come up there in person and we're going to do this again. And we're going to have a good old time, just like the old days.
We look forward to it very much. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you so much to Thomas Frank and Eric Morser. And we will be back for another Northshire Live tomorrow night. So hopefully we'll see some of you again soon.
Okay.
Take care,
so long, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thomas.
Bye.
Have a good evening.